If I were to ask you, what is the number one objection to the Christian faith, and the prime thing, the most common objection raised by unbelievers as to why they don't believe, what would you say? In my experience, it's been the problem of evil and suffering. And this is certainly not a new objection. This one has been around for a long, long time. In fact, the final finished version of this has been around for hundreds of years. David Hume, the philosopher, expressed this most clearly when he said, if there was an all-loving God, he would not desire evil to be in the world. If there was an all-powerful God, he would remove evil from the world. Therefore, if there was an all-loving, all-powerful God, there would be no evil. But there is evil, therefore there is no all-powerful, all-loving God. And whether someone has ever heard it expressed that way or not, it is kind of the thought process that many unbelievers go through. They look at the suffering in the world or the suffering in their own lives. They look at evil that is done by human beings, the Holocaust, cultural revolutions that kill millions of people, even the simple act of a murder of one person over the other, or cruelty or abuse. People look at the natural disasters, a tsunami, an earthquake, a volcano, a hurricane, and they think, how could God be up there having the power to stop all this and not doing it? And for many people, this is an existential crisis, and they're actually asking a good question. The psalmist and many people in the scripture wrestle with the suffering that God allows in this world and the evil that God allows in this world. So is the problem of evil and suffering really an argument against God? Well, the approach that we take, a presuppositional approach, has us first of all look at the assumptions behind that objection. First of all, I want you to notice that if there was no God, if there is no God, there are two things that are true. Number one, everything in this world is exactly the way it's supposed to be. See, the evolutionary worldview says natural selection proceeds by weeding out the weakest. Only the fit survive. Therefore, the way the world is now is the way the world is supposed to be. And yet intuitively, most people feel, and if you ask them, they'll say the world is not the way it's supposed to be. But if there is no God, that thought doesn't make sense. Where do we get the idea that the world is not the way it's supposed to be? But secondly, if there is no God, that does not remove the suffering in our world, right? If there is no God, then the suffering that we agonize over is just the way the world works, and we have to ask, why do we grieve over it? Why do we wrestle with it? Why do we resist evil and suffering so much? And when we do that, we have no one to turn to. So you take God out of the picture of this world of evil and suffering, and now you have no one to turn to, no one who will ever judge the wicked, no one who will ever restore things to the way they're intended to be. Only the Christian worldview says this world is not the way it's supposed to be. That God made the world perfect, but because of human sin, this world is under a curse. And therefore, we live in a world that will someday be fixed, will be restored. We will live in a new creation, a new heaven and a new earth, and those who do evil will be judged. So often when people raise this question of evil and suffering, they think it irretrievably ends the plausibility of God in this world, when in fact, the longing for things to be made right, the longing for justice, the longing for recreation and restoration points toward our innate knowledge, the implanted knowledge of God that Romans 1 says every person has. We long for those who've done evil to face justice, and God says he will do that. We long for things to be restored. We long for new creation to come and all that has been broken by sin to be restored. And Romans 8 tells us the whole creation groans and that someday God will make all things right. So the question of evil and suffering is one we should actually invite as Christians because we can point out what the alternatives are. Apart from Christ, we shouldn't think the world is broken. Apart from the Christian worldview, we would have no hope that anything would ever be made right. And yet that internal longing points to the reality of a God who will someday make all things right. Now, that doesn't answer the question of our present evil and suffering. We can ask the question, okay, So God will make things right, but why is he allowing things now? The answer to David Hume's objection is this: God may have a perfectly good reason why he's allowing evil and suffering in the world now. And that's a hard answer, because we as Christians know that suffering and trial and difficulty strengthens our faith. That's a common theme in Scripture. Romans 5 tells us that God uses suffering to shape us. The entire book of 1 Peter is about not treating suffering as if it's something strange and out of the ordinary. But God uses our suffering, our pain, our grief to draw us to himself, to cleanse our lives of other things that we love more than God and depend on more than God. We call those things idols, idols of the heart. And God teaches us, weans us off the things of the world, the good gifts of God that are otherwise perfectly fine to enjoy. God weans our hearts off them to not trust in them and depend on them. I have a little experience in this. Up until I was 38 years old, I was in perfect health. By God's grace, never had any major health issues. But at 38, out of the blue, I was declared to be an end-stage renal disease. That is, my kidneys were failing. I had no idea that I was sick at all. In fact, they say of kidney disease that you can be down to 5% kidney function and not even know you're sick. Well, mine were about 23%. And I was told I would need a kidney transplant within a year. Well, that rocked my world because I didn't know what suffering was really like. I'd never been in a hospital for myself before. And God took my wife and my family and me through a deep, dark time over the next few years as I got sicker and sicker and sicker, until finally in 2010, I had a kidney transplant. By God's grace, my brother-in-law, my older sister's husband, donated a kidney to me, and I was in good health again. One of the things that takes place in that is every 12 hours for the rest of your life, you have to take immunosuppressant drugs, which keep your body from rejecting the kidney. So for the rest of my life, I live still with kidney disease, but not as serious as would cause organ failure. And about 2019, the summer of 2019, I began to experience cognitive issues where I was struggling to remember what was real and what was not real. My son-in-law rushed me to the hospital, and they found a brain tumor. By God's grace, it was benign, but in the process of getting ready to have that removed, the doctors did an ultrasound of my transplanted kidney, which sits in the front of my abdomen. And in the process, they found a tumor, a lemon-sized tumor. It was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And the disease I'd feared all my life was cancer. In fact, when I had to have a kidney transplant, I thought, boy, at least it's not cancer. Whew. I'm really glad I got this and not something else. So finally, it caught up to me in 2019. Because of my suppressed immune system, my body was able to grow. The cancer cells were able to grow. And I went through about 8 months of tremendous suffering, chemotherapy, multiple hospitalizations, several surgeries, and came very close to dying because I had no immune system and got an infection after surgery. God raised me up, but through that, my wife, my kids, my grandkids suffered tremendously with grief and sorrow. And I would tell you right now, I would never want to go through that again. It was a terrible time of suffering. But I would never trade what God did through our lives in that time period. I'm so thankful for God using suffering. His sovereignty turned that awful time of suffering into gold. And so one of the answers that we give as Christians is that we are suffering people, that we live in a suffering world, and yet God is able to take even our suffering because we know it is temporary. Paul talks about this light and momentary affliction that we endure will produce in us a far greater weight of glory. As Christians, we have that confidence, and even in our confidence, we can share with unbelievers who are struggling with suffering, who are struggling with evil at the hands of other people, that God has not forgotten you. He is sovereign over all things, over your disease, over those doing evil to you. And when we turn to him, we have in him a God who can protect us, a God who can help us even when we do suffer, and a God someday who will make all things right, who will turn back the suffering upon itself so that we will be able to look back and someday say, God, you did the best thing in my life, even though I didn't see it at the time. I often like to compare it to the way a parent often has to put his child through what the child considers to be suffering, whether it's little things like you have to go to bed when you don't want to, or eating your broccoli, or putting a child through a painful medical procedure in order to prevent further damage or disease. That child does not understand what the parent is making them do. But because that parent loves them, they know they can trust the parent even in the suffering, that the parent will only do them good, and the parent is trying to save their life and improve their health. In the same way as Christians, many times we may not know in this lifetime why God has brought the suffering that he has, but we do know him. We do know that he does nothing out of spite. God is not capricious. God only loves and only has the best in store for us. I love Romans 8:32. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him give us all good things? That is, if I can trust God for my greatest need, my guilt before him, my salvation, and God gives his son to suffer and die, the innocent one for the guilty, then in my suffering now, I can trust God even though it hurts, even though I grieve, maybe for the rest of my life in this lifetime, to know that someday God will make all things right. This is our answer for evil and suffering. And it is one that cannot be provided any other way. Apart from the Christian worldview, there is no answer for evil and suffering. And so we are thankful as Christians that God has given this answer in his word, and we can use that comfort that he gives us to help those who are struggling with the problem of evil and suffering.